A 9-year-old girl murdered in cold blood, and the case remained unsolved for 63 years. Until last week. Hi, I'm Louise. This is the Enigma Within, where we talk about true crime, paranormal, and creepy stories. This is the first official episode. We're here. We did it. I'm so excited to talk about this case because it's finally been solved. It's a cold case that has been looked at so many times trying to solve it over the past 63 years, and the family finally have an answer. So let's get straight into it. Let's talk about the murder of Carol Ann Dougherty. Carol Ann Dougherty was born on the 24th of December in 1952. She was a young girl who had a bright future ahead of her. She would attend school, she frequently read her library books, and she would always pray at her local church when she would ride past on her bike to the library. Her family described her as a good child with a good Catholic education. She was the oldest out of her and her sister Kay, who was just 3 years old at the time. The family lived in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. During the 1950s, the town was growing. There were many new residents there moving in and out the area. Cars were kind of a new thing for families in the sense of they were actually affordable now. So there's people moving around, driving a lot more, and going to areas they might not have been to before. So even though the area wasn't huge in itself, there was about 15,000 people in the area or in that community. On the day of the murder, Carol left her home at 4 p.m. to go and return her library books at the Grundy Memorial Library, which was just a short bike ride away, only a mile down the road. She was scheduled to return home within just half an hour, and at this time, so half an hour later, her mother Dorothy began to search for Carol and could not find her anywhere. Dorothy, while driving by, saw Carol's bike parked up at the church. She had a quick look inside but did not find her daughter, and alarmed, she drove home to tell her husband. The books that Carol Ann was taking to the library were still in her satchel on a bike, so she stopped off at the church to pray before going in the library, but she never made it there. Her father Frank was also concerned and began looking for his daughter. He went over to the church where her bike was seen to investigate. He went to St. Mark's Church, he began looking around, and he ended up going into the church choir loft, and underneath a stained glass window he found the body of his daughter, Carol Ann. Her hair was still in her ponytail, her underwear and clothing were removed from the waist down, and one sock was also removed. He quickly called the authorities, which responded in a long manhunt of the predator who killed this 9-year-old girl. The autopsy shows that unfortunately she had been raped and strangled to death. She suffered a crisscross mark on her neck that they believed was made with a belt, and the investigator named it the most brutal attack he had seen within 18 years of his police work. The police theorised that the strangler in the crime used one of Carol Ann's own socks to muffle her screams, which is horrendous to even think about, that he was doing this horrendous act to her and thought, I'll shut you up by taking off your own sock and shoving it in your mouth. And upon hearing this horrific crime, the town came together and about 1,000 people came to the church to remember Carol Ann. So let's have a look at some of the suspects. So the first suspect on the list was Frank Zucchero. He was one of the aging handymen at the time who had been seen staggering drunk on one of the streets nearby the church. The police questioned Frank and he actually confessed to the murder, which is, normally if somebody confesses, you're like, yeah, they did it, we know they did it. Why would you confess otherwise? He described in detail how he murdered and strangled Carol Ann, but the county districts decided, right, I'm going to question you too, I want to get a bit more information about this. So District Attorney Paul Beckett questioned Zucchero, and when he did, Frank was a little bit confused and a little bit delusional, and when they were asked if you intended to kill Carol, Zucchero replied saying, that's what the brain says you do. If you don't, then we'll straighten you out, the brain says, which doesn't entirely make sense. So he seemed a bit delusional to the police, and they were concerned that the confession might not actually be true. Maybe this is a false confession, maybe there's a lot more to this story, this doesn't seem right. And later, the officer that actually got Zucchero to say, yes, I'd murdered Carol Ann, admitted that it was a coerced confession. So Frank was then released, not questioned again. He was ruled out as a suspect. The next suspect in the case was Wayne Roach, whose own parents had phoned the police, or got in contact with the police, I should say, saying that they thought he'd killed Carol Ann. Which, as parents, I honestly think if your child commits a crime, yes, you should report them in. I don't think you should protect your children if they've committed an horrendous crime like a murder. But the evidence that they had will shock you, because it was not good evidence. It was not a lot of evidence. The only evidence they had that made them think that he had killed Carol Ann, at least that I could find publicly on the internet, was a note in his jacket pocket with her name on. So it's just a note that said Carol Ann Dougherty. That was it. This 19-year-old boy was sent to the police, or reported to the police, because of a note. So they found him, they brought him in for questioning, and it wasn't him. He was very easily able to give an alibi, and he was like, I was at a driving test, here's my receipt for the driving test. I wasn't there, it was time-stamped. They knew it wasn't him. The chief investigator of this crime then turned his attention to somebody called Joseph Sabadish. He was a priest at St. Mark's, and his alibi, when being questioned, was proven to be untrue, which is the first red flag for any police officer doing this work. He had told the police that he'd been visiting parishioners at the time of Carol Ann's murder. However, when they were spoken to, they was like, no, he wasn't here. I don't know why he's saying he was here. He wasn't. So they quickly went back to him to try and talk a bit more, try and figure out why he was lying about where he was. Eyewitnesses had also said that they saw him acting strangely on Mill Street, so the shopping district, shortly after the murder, and a woman who knew him quite well called Betty stated that they had rekindled their relationship, or acquaintanceship, should I say. Oh, that's what she quoted. But this relationship that they rekindled quickly soured. He would repeatedly call her at home. He would make really lewd sexual advances towards her, and her husband started recalling the calls, which he gave to the police chief who was investigating this. He would question Joseph on several occasions and begun to create tension, which led to an angry confrontation outside in the street that people witnessed. Joseph said to the chief, "You're a Catholic and you're persecuting Catholics with this investigation," to which the chief replied, "No, Father, I'm a cop trying to figure out who killed that little girl in your church." Later on, Sabadish was taken in for a polygraph test and passed, which led to his release. They were moved on to their next suspect. Their next suspect was William Schrader. He was spotted outside the church not long after Carol's murder and had previously done time in prison for attempted murder and firing a gun. We're off to a great start with this suspect because, of course, if somebody's in prison for attempted murder, they probably tried to do it again. William was known to be a drifter. No one really knows why he was in Bristol, and honestly, from what I could find, no one really knew much about him at all. He was described as devious and a con man. He worked in a factory called the Century Tool Company and lived on the 300 block, which was nearby the church. William was known to have a checkered past, and it was said that as young as 8, he was known to assault young girls by punching them in the face. Of all things you could do as an 8-year-old boy, punching women in the face is not what I'd think you'd be doing. But that's what William was doing when he was a young boy. He was punching women in the face. And at the age of 17, he enlisted in the army, but was later on dishonourably discharged just a year later. And if you don't know, when you're dishonourably discharged, it means that you've done something wrong. You've committed something or done a crime. It could be a crime. It could be just like something that the army don't agree with, and you were discharged because you're not doing the things right. William was seen at the church at about 4:30 on the day of the murder, so not long before her body was found. This is when her parents started panicking, not knowing where she was. William was questioned about this, and he stated that he was at work. He didn't clock out at work until 4:30. So investigators doing their job, like they're going to do, William, they're going to do their job. They went to check his timesheet. So they'd go and see, in 1950, you had to get a stamp on your sheet when you went in and out of work. So they went to check his timesheet, and of course, they found he was not at work. He clocked out at 1:58 on the 19th of October, before Carol Ann's murder, and was not at work for the following 5 days, meaning he was unaccounted for at the time of the murder. Investigators brought this information to William and was like, we checked your alibi, you're lying, what's going on? So then he changed his story. He said, actually no, sorry, I wasn't at work, I was actually fixing my car in the junkyard. Unfortunately, officers could not corroborate this story. The owner of the junkyard, when questioned, could not remember whether they saw William there or not. So that one just went unchecked. Nobody knew whether he actually was there or not. Schrader was then taken to do a polygraph test, which he passed. Now, an important note, I've mentioned polygraph tests a couple of times so far in this episode. Polygraph tests are only approximately 80 to 90% accurate. So there is a high chance that it could be an error, it could be wrong. They're not very accurate. There is so much science that goes into them in the sense of why they're not the most accurate. Most polygraph tests are ones that you would like clip on your finger around your chest, and they check your sweat levels essentially, because the more you sweat, the more stressed you are, which is the more chance that you are lying, because when you lie, your fingers start to sweat, you start to breathe heavier. All of these like different physiological symptoms come out, and that's what it's trying to measure. However, some people's bodies are different. It's not always the most accurate. Some people are able to control those things when they are lying about things. So they're a little bit useless. I could go into way more of the science behind them if people are interested in that in like an episode in the future, but they are quite useless in that sense, which is why they're no longer used in court nowadays. William was taken before a grand jury, but invoked his Fifth Amendment right, and the case went cold. So he refused to answer any of the questions that could incriminate him at the grand jury, and they didn't have enough evidence to convict him, so he was let free. He just left. He carried on doing what he would normally do day by day. The case went cold. They had nothing. Not long after the murder, however, Schrader left Bristol and moved to Louisiana. He was later convicted in 1970 of manslaughter in an unrelated case where his motorhome had set on fire and his stepdaughter's friend was killed inside the motorhome, leaving his stepdaughter as well with brain damage, and his wife was burnt in the fire, however, survived. Later on, a tip was given to the police and he was convicted of manslaughter, not murder, however, because of the way that the evidence was. So there is quite a few cases in his past and after Carol Ann's murder that make people question whether it could be him or not. For years after, the chief of the police at the time chased leads. He kept Carol's photo on his desk until he retired from the force in 1979. And even after he retired, he always kept her picture in his home. In the original investigation as well, it's worth noting that follow-ups hair samples were taken from suspects. Even though they didn't have DNA testing at the time, in the past people were theorising, oh, we'll be able to do something with this at some point, so they'd take it and just keep it, hoping they could use it in the future. William, Joseph and Frank all died before the case was solved. Roach's whereabouts are unknown. Nobody knew if these suspects were the suspects or if there was anything else to do with them. But a breakthrough came last year when the Pennsylvania State Police in November 2024 interviewed Schrader's stepson, Robert LeBlanc, who said Schrader confessed to him on 2 separate occasions that he had murdered a little girl in Pennsylvania church. Now, it's worth noting that his stepson, when he had this confession, his stepson did take it to the police, but it was in a different state at the time. So the states weren't communicating with each other, so this information never got passed on to the Pennsylvania police force, so they never knew that this confession existed and nobody knew what to do with this information. He had said to his stepson that he had killed the girl in Bristol to keep her from talking. The statement from LeBlanc was seen as highly credible because the Bucks County DA said that he had no prior knowledge of the case's specific details, such as Schrader being seen outside the church, his proximity to the crime scene, or the location of Carol Ann's bike. This led to more investigations and DNA testing with William, which again was not available at the time of the case, and once DNA testing was available, because they had collected over 200 hair samples from local men being questioned, they tested 141 of them against the hairs that were found on Carol. So when she was murdered, when they found her body, she had pubic hairs in her hand, and they would test it against this sample. All of them were conclusive that it was not them except one. only one of them could not be ruled out as a possible match: Schrader's. In 2025, a new grand jury re-examined the evidence. The DNA evidence was retested again and submitted to a lab that specialised in cold cases and found a match. They could confirm for a fact that it was William Schrader. The cold case, that is 63 years old, was finally solved. Carol Ann is remembered as a bright young girl who loved to read and ride her bike. Now, her sister says this brings a sense of closure that her parents didn't live to experience. And she says in a quote, "Though nothing can bring Carol back, we can finally let her rest in peace." This case has stumped investigators for years. It can finally be closed. And even though her parents aren't here to see it, they can at least rest knowing that the case is solved. So I wanted to try and link this to some theories. So in the first episode that I posted, I was talking about how I was going to try and link some different theories to the crimes that I talk about when I do talk about crimes. But because so little is known about William Schrader's childhood, or at least that I could find, if it's out there, I couldn't find it myself. And, he passed a lie detector. We don't know what type of childhood he had. We can assume things from the fact he used to punch girls at 8 years old. But not enough is known about him to link a possible theory. He was like it as a child, so we know at 8 years old he was doing things that were violent towards women, and he must have not liked women by the way that he was acting towards them. Because of the fact that he started off so young, however, we can assume that it's either a biological or an environmental theory, which leaves it very, very broad in the sense of pinpointing something specifically. So maybe he had someone in his family who had the same sort of things, or it could just be the way he was, the way his mind worked. There is definitely something sexual in the way that he behaved. I do think it was for some form of release. And I think that the crimes he committed, so he was a serial rapist, it's known that he did commit other crimes, although I could not find much about him and his other crimes that he committed other than the ones I've spoken about. There's not much about them. All of them have some sort of sexual release in there, so I do think a lot of it was sexually motivated, and I think the reason he murdered Carol Ann was for the fact that she wouldn't be able to tell anybody, and he got away with it. He died in 2002. He will never see the repercussions of the crime he's committed, and he will never have to face justice for that crime either, which I think is heartbreaking. And I think that if they did have DNA testing at the time, I do think he would have got the justice and would have got the repercussions that he deserved based on the crimes that he committed. Researching this case was heart-rending to see the effort the police had put in to gain nothing out of it. They didn't have the technology at the time, and I genuinely think if DNA testing was available when this crime had happened, I genuinely think they could have solved it so much sooner. As always, if you have enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to like and subscribe if you're watching on YouTube. If you're listening to this episode on a podcast app, so Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever else you get your podcasts, please don't forget to follow and rate. It really does help me out, and it shows me that you're liking the content I'm putting out, so I know to carry on doing it, which I'm going to carry on doing it anyway. I'm enjoying doing it. It's something I enjoy doing. I like talking about it. Next week's episode is going to be great, so definitely stay tuned for that. But I am Louise, this has been The Enigma Within, and I will see you in the next one.